The date is August 8th and 9th, 1942. The place is a body of water near Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Allies would soon call these waters Ironbottom Sound. On a moonless night, the Imperial Japanese Navy strikes an Allied naval force. It is a defeat that reshapes how America fights for the rest of the war. 3 days before this night, 16,000 Allied Marines splashed ashore at Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Their mission was clear and direct: seize the airfield the Japanese were building, hold it long enough to stop Tokyo's advance down the Solomon chain toward Australia. The Marines did their job. They captured the landing beaches. They overran the half-finished airfield. Soon it would be called Henderson Field. But by the evening of August 8th, the task force that brought them was falling apart. Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded the covering carriers. He had lost 21 aircraft in 3 Japanese air raids. He was exhausted. Coral Sea and Midway had taken everything from him. His ships needed fuel. He decided he no longer needed to stay. At 6 o'clock that evening, Fletcher signaled he was withdrawing his 3 carriers to the southeast. He did not wait for approval. Admiral Turner commanded the transports. He was furious. Without carrier protection, his cargo ships became undefended targets. He decided to withdraw them by dawn. This meant leaving the Marines ashore with only what they could carry and what supplies they had managed to unload. Just hours after landing, the Marines were being abandoned. At 8:55 that night, Turner called an urgent conference. He met with Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, the naval commander of the screening force, and Major General Alexander Vandergrift, who led the Marines. They met aboard Turner's flagship off Guadalcanal. The conference ran past midnight. When it ended, Crutchley made a decision. He did not rejoin his screening force. Instead, he stayed aboard the Australian cruiser Australia in the transport area. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. He did not tell the other cruiser captains. He did not tell Turner. He did not tell his own staff. It was exhaustion and confusion made into command. It was a decision that would cost him control of the battle that was already moving toward him. Miles away, in the waters north of Bougainville, a Japanese striking force was advancing. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had heard about the Allied landings at dawn on August 7th. He commanded Japan's newly formed 8th Fleet from Rabaul. Mikawa was not a reckless man. He had served in the Pearl Harbor Strike Force under Vice Admiral Nagumo. He understood night warfare. The Japanese Navy had trained for it constantly. They drilled under realistic conditions. They accepted casualties as the price of readiness. The Americans had done almost no night training since 1940. What little they had done was filled with artificial exercises. That gap between theory and reality would matter tonight. Mikawa assembled every cruiser he could reach, 7 cruisers total and 1 destroyer. 2 heavy cruisers came from Kavieng, Aoba and Kinugasa. From Rabaul came the flagship Chokai, a heavy cruiser, along with 2 light cruisers, Tenryu and Yubari. Also from Rabaul, the heavy cruisers Furutaka and Kako, and the destroyer Unagi. 8 ships, no battleships, no aircraft carriers, just cruisers and 1 escort, armed with 8-inch guns and a weapon the Americans did not understand. That weapon was the Type 93 torpedo. It was nicknamed the Long Lance by Allied historians, though no American knew that name yet. The torpedo ran 41 feet long. It could travel at 48 to 50 knots and struck with a warhead of nearly 1,100 pounds of explosive. It could reach out farther than anything the Allies had. The Americans had nothing like it. No American cruiser, no American destroyer could match its reach or its punch. American torpedo protection systems were built to resist about 800 to 1,000 pounds of TNT. The Type 93 carried more than that. The Americans did not know what was coming toward them because the Japanese had kept that secret. Mikawa's plan was simple and bold. Rush down the slot at night to avoid air attack. Strike the screening force south of Savo Island. Sink the cruisers. Then swing around and hit the transport fleet. Everything would be finished before dawn, before American aircraft could respond. Then turn north and retreat. 120 miles of clear water ahead. Mikawa knew the risk. He did not know exactly where the American carriers were. They could be 50 miles away. They could be 100. but he believed he could fight through daylight attacks and escape. At 1:30 in the afternoon on August 8th, he signaled his battle plan. Then he moved his flagship Chokai to Rabaul, picked up his light cruiser escort, and headed south at 24 knots. His cruisers formed a single column, 1,200 meters between ships. The approach should have been seen. An Australian Hudson reconnaissance plane from Milne Bay spotted Mikawa's force at 10:25 that morning, 100 miles north of Rabaul. The Hudson crew tried to radio the sighting. They got no answer. They returned to base at 12:42 and filed their report. It did get through, but it reached Admiral Turner at 6:45 that evening, and Turner was told the sighted force was a seaplane tender, not cruisers. Admiral McCain commanded the Allied air search for the region. He was supposed to fly reconnaissance over the slot that afternoon. He did not fly those missions. He never told Turner they were not flown. Turner thought someone was watching the slot. Nobody was. Around 8 o'clock that evening, Mikawa's force crossed into dangerous waters around Bougainville. 2 Allied Hudsons spotted them as they moved through the straits. Anti-aircraft fire drove the planes away. Mikawa changed course to avoid a submarine that was too close. Weather helped him. Overcast skies and brief rain squalls hid his ships. He launched floatplane reconnaissance from his cruisers. By afternoon, his floatplanes reported almost perfect intelligence about Allied positions. The transports sat at Guadalcanal. The screening cruisers were scattered on picket lines. There was a gap between the radar pickets west of Savo Island. When darkness came, Mikawa increased speed to 30 knots. The sea was flat. The visibility was too good. But his ships were hard to see in darkness. His crews had trained for this. Each Japanese cruiser carried 23 carefully selected spotters. These men had exceptional night vision. They trained to use giant binoculars that could detect light nearly 1,000 times better than the naked eye. They could spot a ship 5 miles away in total darkness. The American crews were running on exhaustion after 2 days of landings and air attacks. Ships were at condition too, meaning half the crew stood watch while half rested nearby. Some officers were in their bunks. The American screening force was split by Savo Island into 3 groups. South of the island, the Australian cruisers Australia and Canberra, the American heavy cruiser Chicago, and 2 destroyers, Bagley and Patterson. North of Savo were 3 American heavy cruisers, Vincennes, Astoria, Quincy, with destroyer escorts Helm and Wilson. East of the island were 2 more cruisers, San Juan and Hobart, with 2 destroyers. Out front, west of Savo, were 2 destroyer radar pickets, Blue and Ralph Talbot. These pickets mounted SC-type surface warning radar. The sets could see targets at 10 miles if everything worked perfectly. But Blue's captain had reduced his radar to intermittent scans to avoid detection. Ralph Talbot was doing continuous sweeps. As the night wore on, the gap between the 2 destroyers grew. When both ships reached the ends of their patrol tracks at 1:10 in the morning, on August 9th, they reversed course. Now the gap between them was 14 miles. Mikawa's force entered that gap at 1:32 a.m., moving at 30 knots. Undetected. At 1:54 a.m., Japanese lookouts spotted Blue at about 5 miles distance. Mikawa was ready. He slowed to 22 knots to reduce the wake that might give him away. Every gun on every ship was trained on Blue. Every torpedo tube was armed and ready. When Blue was less than 2 miles away, she reversed course. She had reached the end of her patrol track. She steamed away. Her crew never knew they had just passed within 2 kilometers of 8 Japanese warships. Seeing his force was still hidden, Mikawa accelerated again. At 1:31 a.m., he gave the order to every ship. Independent firing. Then he launched floatplanes that dropped parachute flares directly over the American transport area and directly over the American cruisers. In seconds, Canberra and Chicago were bathed in white light. This is where we turn to the men inside the ships. This is where the history becomes personal. On Canberra, the Australian cruiser, a young officer was working in the radar hut. David Medley was a physics graduate from Melbourne University. He was only 23. He had volunteered for radar duty because of his interest in radio and electronics. He had helped install Canberra's new Type 271 radar, one of the most advanced sets the Allies had. The hut was small and crowded. Medley's job was to read what the radar showed. All that night, the radar was running. The set could detect ships nearby. But with islands masking signals and so many Allied vessels in the area, it was almost impossible to know which were friends and which were enemies. At about 1:43 in the morning, flares lit the sky over Canberra. The first shell hit the bridge. David Medley heard the explosion. The power failed. The ship went dark. The radar scope went dark. Medley and his operators had no way to know what was happening above them. There were no radios in the hut. There were no phones. Just the sound of the ship being hit, again and again. The shells came from multiple directions at close range. Chokai, Furutaka, Aoba, and Kako were all firing. Between 1:44 and 1:48 a.m., Canberra was struck by 24 armor-piercing shells. She was struck by at least 2 torpedoes. The first salvo killed her gunnery officer. The first salvo mortally wounded her captain, Frank Getting, an officer the crew loved. Canberra lost power to her guns. She could not fire a single shot in return. In 3 minutes, she was destroyed. The signalman at her wheel followed the captain's dying order to beach the ship on nearby Savo Island. But Canberra was sinking faster than she could move. She settled into the water, burning from end to end. By dawn, she would be scuttled deliberately to keep her from Japanese hands. Chicago was the next ship in line. Her crew had been awakened by the flares and gunfire. The captain, Howard Bode, ordered illuminating shells fired into the darkness. Nothing came. Then a torpedo struck Chicago's bow. The explosion tore through the ship like a blade. Damage control crews fought the fires. Chicago could still move. But instead of staying with the other screening cruisers, instead of warning them, instead of joining the fight, Chicago turned west. She turned away from the enemy. She turned away from her sister ships. Her captain never tried to warn the other cruisers. He never tried to coordinate a defense. Now Mikawa's force turned its guns north. 3 American heavy cruisers were steaming north of Savo Island, Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy. Their captains had gone to their bunks. The ships were at condition too. The men had heard the flares. They had heard distant gunfire. They had heard fragments of warnings on the radio. But there was confusion about what was happening. Was the gunfire friendly or enemy? Men began to move to general quarters, but it took time. At about 1:50 a.m., Japanese searchlights flared to life. They stabbed out from the darkness. They pinned each American cruiser in a blinding cone of light. The Japanese used searchlights for illumination. They used flares. They used the burning American ships themselves, reflecting light off the clouds. The Americans were caught between darkness and light. They were invisible to themselves, but visible to the enemy. On Astoria, the junior gunnery officer had been waiting for orders from the bridge. He heard the guns open fire. He made a quick radar check and saw 4 blips on his fire control scope. 4 Japanese cruisers, there on his scope, clear as day. He radioed to the bridge that he had a target at 7,000 yards. He was ready to fire, but before he could, his commanding officer arrived on the bridge. The captain thought his ship might be firing on friendly vessels. He ordered a ceasefire. It was a catastrophic order. By the time the captain was convinced the radar blips were enemies, precious seconds had passed. The Japanese fire was falling like rain. Astoria was struck again and again. Her engine rooms were destroyed. Her fires grew beyond control. She would burn through the entire engagement. She would continue burning after the Japanese withdrew. Her crew fought those fires with courage that astonished the Japanese observers. Officers would note later that even though Astoria was completely ablaze and taking tremendous damage, the ship kept firing. When Astoria's gunners landed a 3-inch shell hit on Chokai's forward turret, they momentarily silenced the Japanese flagship's main battery. But it was not enough. Vincennes was hit by 2 torpedoes. The first struck at 1:55 a.m. It tore through the light cruiser with overwhelming force. Her captain ordered an increase in speed to 25 knots. He turned toward the enemy, trying to close the range and get his guns to bear. But Vincennes was already breaking apart. Within minutes, a second torpedo struck. It came from the light cruiser Yubari. All of Vincennes' boiler rooms were destroyed. The ship came to a stop. She was burning everywhere. She was listing to port. At 2:16 a.m., her captain gave the order to abandon ship. Vincennes sank at 2:50 a.m. Quincy had tried to fight. Her gunners fired multiple salvos at the Japanese cruisers. At least one shell hit Chokai. It tore through the captain's chart room just 6 meters from Admiral Mikawa himself. That shell killed or wounded 36 men on the flagship, but the Japanese fire was too heavy. The torpedoes were too accurate. At 2:10 a.m., shells from Ioba killed or wounded almost everyone on Quincy's bridge, including the captain. Quincy's guns fell silent. She was struck by 2 torpedoes. One came from Tenryu, one came from Ioba. She began to sink, bow first. At 2:38 a.m., she went down. The entire action from first shot to withdrawal lasted less than an hour. 4 heavy cruisers were destroyed or sinking. Over 1,000 sailors were dead. Most of the Japanese ships had fired at will, guided by their spotters and their searchlights. Nearly every torpedo had found its target. Nearly every salvo had hit. The American ships, in shock and confusion, had fired back. Some fired bravely, some fired effectively. But they had no coordination. They had no doctrine for night battle. They had no discipline that turned individual shots into concentrated firepower. At 2:16 a.m., even as the northern group was being destroyed, Mikawa conferred with his staff. His ships were scattered. He did not know the exact location of all of them. He had expended most of his ammunition. He had no air cover. He believed American carriers were in the area. His ships had fired off nearly all their torpedoes. Reloading a torpedo tube at sea took hours. It was labor-intensive and slow. Mikawa ordered his force to withdraw. He would not attack the transport fleet. He would not complete what he had started. At 2:20 a.m., his cruisers turned north and headed back up the slot. They left behind silence, broken only by screams and the roar of fires consuming American ships. The consequences were immediate. By dawn on August 9th, Admiral Turner had decided to withdraw all his transports and cargo ships. They had been only partially unloaded. The Marines on Guadalcanal suddenly found themselves alone on an island. They were without most of their supplies. They were without their transport ships. They were without air cover. A few thousand exhausted Americans would now have to hold their beachhead with whatever ammunition and food they had managed to land. The Japanese had won a complete tactical victory. They had sunk 4 cruisers in an hour. They had driven the American Navy away from Guadalcanal. But Mikawa's decision not to attack the transports, made in that moment of uncertainty at 2:16 in the morning, would prove to be Japan's greatest strategic mistake of the campaign. Those 19 transport ships, partially unloaded as they were, survived the night. In the weeks that followed, they would return again and again to supply the Marines. They would bring reinforcements and ammunition across dark waters. The Marines would cling to Henderson Field through 100 desperate nights of Japanese bombardment and assault. And the seizure of that one airfield would mark the beginning of the end for Japan. In the aftermath of Savo Island, the United States Navy was forced to confront a hard truth. Technology alone was not enough. Radar had failed not because the machines were broken, but because the Navy did not understand its own tools. It had relied on radar to do the thinking. The Japanese, meanwhile, had relied on something older and harder to defeat. Trained sailors with good eyes, discipline, and a doctrine perfected over years of practice. At Savo Island, that doctrine proved more reliable than any machine. The defeat sparked a transformation. Admiral Ernest King ordered sweeping changes. All cruisers were retrofitted with emergency diesel-electric generators. Fire mains were redesigned to survive multiple hits. Ammunition lockers were reduced in size and redistributed around the ships. More importantly, the Navy finally began to take night training seriously. Officers learned that radar was a tool to be used with judgment, not a substitute for thinking. Captains learned to coordinate their fires instead of acting as separate ships. Sailors drilled for night combat as realistically as they had before the war, or more so because now they had seen the price of neglect. By the end of 1942, the lessons of Savo Island had been applied to every cruiser, every destroyer, and every task force in the Pacific. When the Navy returned to the waters around Guadalcanal in the months that followed, they had learned. The Marines hung on. Reinforcements came. Henderson Field held. In November and December, when Japanese forces tried to retake the island, They found American sailors and soldiers who had been bloodied once and had learned from their wounds. The war in the Pacific would continue for 30 more months. Millions more would die. But the tide had turned at Guadalcanal in the first American offensive, in the weeks after the shock of Savo Island. The Japanese had struck a devastating blow. They had proven that superior training and doctrine could overcome American numbers and American industrial power, at least for one night. But they had failed to recognize that American capacity to learn from defeat and come back stronger was far more formidable than any single naval engagement. 41 years later, in 1983, a retired Mikawa would reflect on that night. He would remember the guns, the burning ships silhouetted against darkness, the moment when he had chosen to withdraw. Looking back, he would acknowledge he could have attacked the transports. He had the opportunity, he had the force, he had the skill. But in that moment of confusion and uncertainty in the darkness, faced with a battle he was winning but could not fully see, he had calculated the risks and chosen caution. He had struck a brilliant blow and then withdrawn into the night, leaving unfinished what he had begun. In that moment of caution lay the seed of Japan's eventual defeat. On the deck of Canberra, in that moment when the power failed and David Medley heard the explosion, history had shifted. In the confusion and noise and fire and death, in the screams of men and the thunder of guns, in the decisions made in darkness by exhausted officers trying to comprehend an enemy they had underestimated, the course of the war in the Pacific had turned. Savo Island was not the end of the fight for Guadalcanal. It was the beginning of American victory.